With all of the rumors concerning the PlayStation 5 Pro and a potentially new upgraded Xbox console releasing in a couple of years' time, I think it's important to not just understand what the potential specifications would be, but also the reason that, for example, Sony would want to launch these new upgraded systems. After all, if we understand the why, we can better understand the how, the potential release date, and the potential specifications. And also, I think it's just quite interesting from getting a better understanding as to what the market is eventually going to be driving towards. For example, VR, metaverse, and tons of other things that we're going to be discussing, he hits the microphone, in this very video. Now, of course, I released a video quite a while ago that I'd been hearing that the PlayStation 5 Pro was in existence, as well as potential specifications and performance targets, but now it seems that several other people on the internet, not least of which even a TV manufacturer, has been discussing that as well. So let's go into this with fresh eyes, and also what I've personally been hearing from numerous sources, as well as based upon some public information, and try to get a better handle as to what Sony in particular are aiming to achieve with the PlayStation 5 Pro. And we're going to do that right after this message from the video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Brilliant, an excellent interactive learning platform focused on STEM. For many, nothing makes our eyes glaze over faster when learning than watching an overly long lecture video. Brilliant is a great way to learn interactively, meaning that courses are on hand and engaging. STEM can be intimidating, but Brilliant offers courses designed for all levels, starting as a beginner and then courses moving to immediate and then advanced, allowing you to learn at your own pace. When signing up, you can choose not only your math comfort level, but also what you're trying to get out of your Brilliant experience. For example, whether you're trying to expand your professional skills or learn as a teacher or student. With 60 plus courses on offer, the perfect one for you is just waiting to be discovered. For me, I've enjoyed the computer science fundamentals and programming with Python. The interactive nature of the courses were a great approach. It's not enough to be told that you got the question wrong, but being told why you got the question wrong and being able to interact with various objects to understand why your answers were incorrect is very helpful. Plus, you can get started for free with a 7-day free trial if you head over to brilliant.org/RGT. The first 200 people will also receive 20% off of the annual membership. Before we plow on with the PlayStation 5 Pro, let's look back at the previous upgrade, which of course would be Generation 8.5, or if you prefer, the Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro. Now, these consoles were significant upgrades to the 2013 launch consoles for both Sony as well as Microsoft. The Xbox One X was massively superior to the launch console. And the main reason that Sony as well as Microsoft launched these systems, of course, as most of you know, was that when the 2013 systems debuted, 1080p was by far the most common resolution that most people had in access to in their homes with TV screens. In fact, many still had 720p. But by the time the Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro launched, 4K HDR screens were much more prevalent in the marketplace. And of course, an Xbox One base system, for example, trying to play a game on a 4K screen, especially with no HDR and all of that, it just didn't look good. And let's face it, we're seeing that right now with the original Switch hardware. It just is starting to look a little bit long in the tooth. But Sony and Microsoft significantly upgraded their previous generation systems. They outfitted them with significantly more GPU power, tons of additional memory bandwidth, and small upgrades to their CPU. Microsoft did some actually quite cool stuff with their SoC, for example, embedding essentially anyway DirectX instructions onto their GPU, which basically reduced CPU overhead. But the long and the short of it was, we had games much closer to the 4K resolution, or at least significantly higher resolution, capable of HDR support, and most of the time anyway, much higher frame rates, or at least more stable frame rates. Now, they weren't capable of 120Hz, because TVs back then typically weren't capable of that, and even if they were, Jaguar wasn't really going to put out enough performance for that. In fact, a lot of games, even back then, were struggling with 60Hz because of the Jaguar processors. But you kind of get an idea what Microsoft and Sony were going for with those machines. So to summarize then, with Generation 8 to 8.5, 1080p to 4K adoption. That was ultimately the goal with Sony and Microsoft in empowering developers to offer games at much higher resolution, and of course this made sense given AAA developers were even creating a lot of games on the PC at the time, and basically speaking, people weren't super happy with playing, for example, the original Xbox One games on a 4K screen. You could just kind of see the pixels. Consoles obviously have finite amounts of power. No matter how much juice Sony, Nintendo, or Microsoft cram into a console at launch, the limits of the hardware are eventually reached. With fixed specifications in mind though, developers can leverage clever programming tricks by exploiting subtle nuances in the console's architecture and get more performance. Nothing new here, of course. The launch PlayStation 3 games are just not as impressive as later PS3 titles. For example, look at Last of Us. Who would have thought that this would be achievable on the PS3 when you first saw the launch games? Or Perfect Dark Zero on the Xbox 360? Is this even comparable to the Gears of War games on the Xbox 360, especially close to the end of the life? No, just obviously not. But recently there's been a ton of buzz online when a TV company, TCL, held a conference, and performance targets and release dates of upgraded consoles, both the PlayStation 5 Pro and new Series systems from Xbox, were revealed. Maybe. According to TCL, the launch release dates will fall between 2023 and 2024. For reference, this is about a year later than my own information. I've heard more likely 2024, 2025, with 2024 being the more likely candidate. Significant performance upgrades, though, are expected for Gen 9.5. TCL suggests it's going to be an RX 7700 XT target for the specifications. Of course, the PS5 Pro and Series systems will likely differ slightly, not only in their specifications, but just overall designs. But AMD's own RX 7700 XT, according to TCL, will be roughly where this upgraded hardware will fall. But the RX 7700 XT, at least as I'm typing this out, doesn't exist, at least officially. It's based on AMD's RDNA 3 architecture, which is scheduled to launch later this year for PC, and also expected to offer a massive performance upgrade over the current crop of top-end AMD cards. Now, AMD have officially stated that in terms of performance per watt, RDNA 3 is going to offer over 50% over RDNA 2, which is obviously a great candidate for a new console. But things get kind of tricky because TCL didn't actually provide code names for the GPU, instead just simply saying RX 7700 XT. And again, because these cards haven't officially been named by AMD and we have no idea what the specifications are for unnamed cards, it could mean it's based on N32 or N33. N33 could be the RX 7600, or it could also be the RX 7700 XT. The way the information is presented here, though, it's more likely to be N33. You can see the difference in both N32 and 33 based upon my own leaked information. This seems to be tallying up with what many other respected leakers in the industry are stating, and I basically put my information out, and yeah, now it seems to be roughly what others are saying as well. Therefore, I'm going to be proceeding with the idea that TCL are predicting an N33 based design. This also makes further sense given the launch window as early as 2023. There'd be a ton of production challenges for an even more powerful system. We'll touch on some of those later. But from my own leaks in the industry at large, we're looking at a N33 based product which is going to be roughly on par with an RX 6900 XT from AMD based on RDNA 2, but with a key difference. It's going to be significantly better at ray tracing. The RT performance is particularly key here. The question, though, before we proceed any further is, well, do TCL actually know this for certain? For example, were they briefed by Sony or Microsoft, or is this just educated speculation? I.e., they've been told something through back channels, which can definitely happen within the industry. Or is it just idle speculation? My guess is that TCL haven't revealed anything officially. Because, let's face it, if, for example, Sony had briefed TCL and then TCL had put this information in public, that's kind of breaking NDA. Therefore, it's more likely to be speculation. Whether this is educated speculation based upon something they've been told through back channels, or whether this is just them putting 2 plus 2 together and then putting the slide out, well, I'm going to leave down to your discretion. What I will say is that I put out an older exclusive video for the PS5 Pro. My information, which has been told to me by a couple of sources, and I will say they've been really accurate with a ton of stuff for RDNA 3, which has been backed up by others, plus some other stuff, including AMD's Phoenix. But then again, any information can be wrong. And what I will say is my source told me that the performance targets PS5 Pro were around 2 times faster in raster over the base console and around 2.5 times faster for ray tracing. Now, critically, the ray tracing is a really important thing because I was also told some of the performance goals and goals of the console at large from Sony for the upgraded hardware. Before we go further, I also want to give the obvious caveat. This is early stuff. The entire project should just get absolutely scrapped, especially what's going on just in the world at the moment. Things are not exactly stable for many reasons, which I don't really want to go into, but you all know what I'm talking about. Sony could therefore decide, you know what, the economy's screwed, let's just hold things back and move to the PS6. Now, again, this is not happening so far, but it could. There could also be a major upgrade to the decision for the performance of the system. Maybe Sony will go more powerful. Something might happen at Microsoft and Sony said, yep, that's just not good enough. It's also not a secret that typically there are multiple considered designs for a console, and this is decision that is decided with performance, pricing, heat, and tons of other factors. So, for example, Sony could have a couple of competing designs, and I only know about design A, and there's also design B. This is not new, and this is not a revelation. We've even seen it way back in the day with, say, the Sega Dreamcast. Hell, even the Sega Saturn got a major upgrade towards the launch because of Sony's PlayStation. An SH4 CPU was actually discussed with the Dreamcast pretty much initially, but while this was kept, Sega had actually bought a significant stake in the now defunct 3DFX. 3DFX were actually bought, or rather all their IP was bought by Nvidia. Many of the employees also went over, of course, to Nvidia. The initial Dreamcast goal, though, was a 3DFX-based chipset. What wasn't known by 3DFX and everyone who was reporting that 3DFX were a shoo-in, given the fact that, well, there were actually press statements even from 3DFX themselves that there were going to be partnership with Sega, is that there are actually 2 competing designs. The 3DFX Voodoo chipset was being, I believe, headed up by Sega America, but the other design was Power VR, which was Sega of Japan. I don't really need to say to you guys that if you look at the Dreamcast, there's no 3DFX logo, despite the fact that 3DFX made public statements. I think they even went to try to sue Sega because the rug was pulled pretty much last minute. So yeah, to my current understanding though, the goals haven't changed, at least the past several months. But the question is though, why are Sony releasing this upgraded hardware? What can it do to excite not just gamers, but entice developers to target towards upgraded hardware? In a nutshell, there are several main goals that I've been told about. The first is improved ray tracing. Not just higher detail, but higher frame rates. The second, a premium VR experience. For example, more liberal use of ray tracing, better visuals, and so on and so forth. Another big one though is premium traditional gaming experience, i.e. a 4K TV screen. Particularly given Sony themselves are porting many of their own titles now to PC, and of course to generally offer high performance console options to PC gaming. Because, let's be honest, Sony doesn't want PC ports to just totally and utterly outshine what the PS5 is capable of in a couple of years. RTX 40 and RDNA 3 launched this year for PC, and they are just ridiculously powerful. But let's focus on ray tracing first. Sony has been infamously quiet on the intricate workings of the PlayStation 5. Mark Cerny, the lead designer, in both interviews and the company's Road to PS5 event, has stated that ray tracing is a big focal point for Sony, and outside of statements, well, what actually has Sony been doing? The answer is a lot. Sony's own studios such as Insomniac have been very aggressive with the push towards ray tracing in titles, with 60 FPS modes in games, albeit with internally rendered resolution being much lower, and reconstruction technologies being used to output, quote unquote, to a higher resolution. But this is basically Sony experimenting and pushing game engines and asking questions internally, such as what would it take to achieve 60 FPS multi-bounce RT? For example, if on a PS5 base console, the RT can run at 60 FPS on something like Ratchet & Clank with 1080p and reconstruction to a higher output, what would more powerful hardware, particularly with improved ray tracing performance, with access to much more advanced reconstruction technology, bring us? What would we need for 60 FPS multi-bounce with increased resolution? What about 120? What limits can we push? In terms of enabling this in hardware, there have been a few critical pieces of public information. The first is a patent from Sony regarding ray tracing. I'm not going to deep dive into this patent, I've discussed it ad nauseum several times now, but the patent definitely does not provide a complete picture as to the target hardware. But we can assume it's more likely to be a PS5 Pro. It would indicate that the console is considerably more powerful than the base PS5. Keeping this part of the video simpler, the PS5's ray tracing hardware is largely established using AMD's RDNA 2 graphics IP, with stuff, such as the TMU, being one of the more critical pieces, as the hybrid TMU for RDNA 2 runs triangle intersection testing. It's the same on Xbox, it's the same on desktop, and it's the same on PS5. The PS5 then is largely a match for the desktop implementation, and the RX 6000 series desktop GPUs for ray tracing lag considerably behind the RTX 30 counterparts from Nvidia when it comes to ray tracing. As of the time I'm recording this though, we don't know 100% what's changed for RDNA 3, but I do believe there's significant upticks in performance to much better match what Nvidia have achieved with RTX 30. Now, whether this Sony patent is based on AMD's own approach for RDNA 3, or whether they've forged their own path, which is probably less likely, or whether it's a mixture of both, we just don't know. Sony could have at least customized some of their ray tracing implementation, but this patent does indicate that it's significantly more advanced than RDNA 2 for multiple reasons. Again, I've gone over this much more in depth in a previous video, so if you want to go ahead and check that out, you can. Another linchpin would be the reconstruction technologies. A source which initially leaked to me some of the details of AMD's FSR2, which actually turned out to be really accurate. For example, that it was temporal based, much improved image quality, and would still run on competitor hardware. As a side note, the only thing that's left to be confirmed by the source is whether the improvements on RDNA 3 architectures work with FSR2. I was told that the image quality may be a little better, but again, we don't know that for certain. I'll be interested to see if that ends up being true or not. But what they also told me is that Sony themselves are working on their own upsampling tech. I originally thought that they were referring to some variant of FSR2, but allegedly no. This technology is being developed by Sony's own graphics researchers and designed around image reconstruction, particularly improving ray tracing performance. I stress, I cannot personally verify this, but there have been a few very intriguing public developments which hint that maybe this is true, not least of which is a conference Sony held on their own YouTube channel. It shows ray tracing reconstruction from lower resolution to higher resolution. As another tangent, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, another source told me that DLSS 3.0 is real. In fact, I've had a few sources now. And one of them told me that the ray tracing performance improvement is bigger than the traditional raster performance. This is not confirmed by Nvidia, but perhaps it's a sign to the industry at large in its direction. Back to Sony in their conference though, it was more of a discussion of offline renderers, i.e. movies, but this research could be probably transferable, at least some variant thereof. Don't forget, Nvidia's first demonstration of its reconstruction technology was for photographs and movies, but eventually it formed the basis because of the neural networks for RTX 30 graphics cards and DLSS. I want to be very clear here. The goals for Sony's PS5, at least some of them, would be more pixels for traditional TVs at higher frame rates, multi-bounce RT and improving the RT and general effects, and premium VR. And generally speaking, premium gaming is going to be a really big part of this. There have also been some target specifications floating around for other sources, some of which were compiled by Foxy Games on Twitter. Now, no, I'm not actually calling him out here. He's a really cool guy. He simply compiled the information. He didn't create this, so I'm merely giving my 2 pennies. But I am skeptical of these specifications, and there's a few reasons. The first is the mention of 240Hz. Without RT, even with RT, it would be ridiculous. Because why would Sony or the PS5 Pro require 240Hz? According to Sony's own information, the PSVR 2 tops out at 120Hz, so there's no benefit there. For traditional screens, PC gamers have access to 165, 240, hell, even 360. But living room TVs are just a different beast. 120Hz is going to be the default for many years, and gamers feel that that's absolutely fine. In my opinion, given Sony's track record, the PS5 Pro would be unlikely to push to ultra-high refresh rates. I'm also skeptical that Microsoft would go this approach with their own system as well, for much the same reason. And there's also technical issues as well, because, well, aside from the whole screen issues that I just mentioned, briefly, frame rates over 120Hz become increasingly a challenge not just for the system's GPU, but CPU too. Many AAA games released for the PS5 or Xbox Series X, even if their resolution was only 720p or even lower, simply would not have the CPU overhead to push towards 240Hz. The CPUs in the consoles are just not fast enough, even on PC, where ultra-fast processors such as the 12900K or AMD's 5950X exist. 240Hz isn't easy to lock in with most AAA games. Some tasks are also very single-thread bound, and outside of all of this, it just doesn't mesh with what Sony's public goals have been. For the PS5 Pro then, assuming my predictions and info are right so far in terms of the goals of the system, as well as the targets, I think it's much more likely that we would see Sony keep 8 CPU cores, 16 threads. Going wider, i.e. more cores, isn't necessarily better for frames. What they could do though is boost the CPU clocks significantly and use a later Zen architecture. The Series X and PS5 both use variants of Zen 2 with some tweaks here or there, but Sony could basically just use Zen 3 or Zen 4. Zen 3 is kind of old now, it's been out for, well, a while on PC, and Zen 4 is launching later this year, and it's going to go much higher in terms of clock frequency. Sony could use similar methods found in the PS4 Pro, for example, to downclock its CPU if running a PS5 base game. AMD have already demoed a Zen 4 processor hitting an all-core of 5.5 GHz for 16 cores in a lighter gaming workload. Sony sticking to an 8-core processor with a more modest clock speed compared to the desktop chips for power consumption purposes is certainly possible. For GPU, things get much trickier. Sony designed the original PS5 as a narrow design, 36 compute units with the frequency cranked significantly higher than the Series X, is running about 2.23 GHz. Now, due to large differences in compute units, the Series X does have a T-flop advantage, but the story doesn't really end there. For the PS4 Pro, Sony simply doubled the number of compute units versus the PS4 base, and also gave a modest clock frequency bump too. For the PS5 though, the raw number of shaders, 2304, remains the same as the PS4 Pro, but with much more advanced architecture, and the clock frequency rose from 911 to over 2200 MHz. I'll likely go deeper into this in another video, as it's a huge topic. But honestly, Sony has a ton of options here, and it gets much more complicated given that the PS5 Pro or Series upgrade, whatever it ends up being called, would much more likely be using RDNA 3 or RDNA 4. In GPU performance, there's a massive number of factors outside of T-flops or the number of compute units, such as pixel fill rate, which is a combination of, say, ROPS multiplied by clock frequency. the latencies across the GPU, and a ton of other things come into play here. In a nutshell, the Series X and PS5 designs are rather different, and Sony's decision is throughput-based, i.e. pushing data through the console's pipes as fast as possible. I assume this would also carry into the PS5 Pro. For reference, the RDNA 2 architecture for PC hits 200 to 300 MHz than what the PS5 can achieve. With overclocking, I even got my 6800 XT provided to me by AMD to over 2700 MHz, and my MSI Gaming X Trio card hits similar speeds. For RDNA 3 though, according to my own information that I've been leaking for months, well, RDNA 3 is getting quite close to or even beating, depending on which sources told me things and which variant of the card, i.e. whether it's N31, 32 or 33, can get close to or exceed 3 GHz. It's not hard to imagine an upgraded Series X console, for example, with much higher clock frequencies, 800 MHz or what have you above the Series X, and perhaps additional compute units, and Sony cranking their own frequencies too. According to my own information, AMD's own Phoenix APUs seem to, and by the way this info seems to have been backed up by others at this point, AMD's Phoenix APUs have 1536 RDNA-free shaders. This is across 6 workgroup processors, although it's possible there's actually higher end SKUs. This runs at 3 GHz, which is about 9 T-flops of performance. That's not too far behind the PS5 base system. This means that you have a system which is running at 9 T-flops with a TDP of just 60 watts. RDNA 3, though, is a major architectural overhaul compared to RDNA 2, including how shaders are distributed. AMD have somewhat confirmed this, but not the entire thing, but it's believed that each workgroup processor basically has 256 shaders versus 128 of RDNA 2. Again, it's quite early to talk about this super in depth, but it's not very difficult to imagine a PS5 Pro could easily reach 20 T-flops plus. Then there's IPC improvements from the architecture, plus anything custom that Sony would do as well. Because really, the custom work is what actually gives consoles a big win. The PS4 Pro, for example, was largely based on Polaris from AMD, but also incorporated several elements of AMD's own Vega architecture. This included rapid packed math for FP16 support. It goes without saying, though, that 448 GB per second of bandwidth that the PS5 has just wouldn't be able to feed the Pro. So what would be the answer? Well, it's possible that Sony could use some type of caching technology such as Infinity Cache, which is now evolved for RDNA 3 to use MCDs, at least for Navi 31 and 32. MCDs basically incorporate not just the cache itself, but also a memory controller. We've actually seen a variant of this technology, vCache, in CPUs like the Ryzen 5800X3D from AMD. And my guess, though, is that they're probably going to go with a more traditional and cheaper method, simply going wider with the memory bus. For example, and this is just speculation, Sony could raise the memory bus from 256 to 320-bit and use faster clocked memory as well. This would solve a couple of issues, but they would have to balance this between power, PCB complexities, manufacturing costs, die size, yields, tons of other things, basically. It's not just as easy as just saying, well, let's just do that approach because it's the simplest. There are so many factors you need to take into consideration. I want to be clear that I don't have a full answer when it comes to the PS5's architecture right now, but given the target release of 2024 or later, it follows that Sony would at the very least go with RDNA 3. I was also told for the Xbox that they're choosing between several designs at the moment and they're kind of messing around, but they haven't exactly decided on their approach. I imagine Microsoft will probably launch a little later than Sony, but I could be wrong. I imagine if they do launch later, they're probably going to have the performance advantage, like with the Xbox One X versus the PS4 Pro. But again, that is speculation. That is not based on concrete information. I also said that Sony have been working on a PS5 shrink. This is possibly a Slim, which leveraged the 6nm process from TSMC. This could possibly reduce heat output, possibly manufacturing costs. Unfortunately, manufacturing processes at the moment aren't exactly cheap. Microsoft themselves pointed out that beyond 7nm, cost savings start to reduce a little. This was actually even mentioned during the Hot Chips conference from the company. Andrew Goosen from Microsoft also stated, 7nm is still cheaper per transistor than the previous ones, it's just that 7nm is where it potentially starts to go up. You do get other benefits like increased clock rates, and you get the benefits of better power, but those aren't things that can directly apply to cost reductions. This is an interview, by the way, with Digital Foundry / Eurogamer. I'll leave a link, of course, down below. My guess, though, is that probably if the PS5 Pro and upgraded series consoles do exist, it'll be at a price premium, and probably more expensive than perhaps even the PS5's introductory price. Touching a little more on premium VR experiences, though, it's no secret Sony has invested heavily into Epic Games. Unreal Engine 5 is ridiculously flexible and powerful as an engine, and has been crafted for the next generation of hardware, ideally suited to movies, games and VR, and the metaverse is a big part of this. Ultimately, there have been a number of intriguing patents from Sony as well, including but not limited to allowing users to essentially attend virtual events such as concerts, create custom representations, avatars if you will, of themselves in the metaverse, and even spectate players in games. For example, imagine you're able to, as a spectator, go between watching someone driving in a racing game from the stands to, from a press of a button, be inside the passenger seat of their car. Or remember Guile's stage in Street Fighter 2, where the bystanders would be watching Guile zone out opponents, for the person to eventually get impatient, jump, and Guile yells "Splash Kick!" and knocks his opponent out of the air. Well, imagine being the bystander, able to turn your head to watch the fight. The metaverse is pretty early. I recently discussed it at length actually with a bunch of other stuff with the Kronos Group and Nvidia's Neil Trevitt. So you can go ahead and check out the interview if you want by searching for it on the channel. If and how the metaverse takes off, how popular it is, and of course what content people make, it's still really early days. But for a company such as Sony, it's hard to ignore the ideas of user-generated content, from the appeal of streamers having viewers being able to interact with their game, or being able to have popular artists appear on stage and sell seats. The VR situation becomes a lot more intriguing though when it comes to Sony's PlayStation Portable console, but that's a situation for another day. While PlayStation Home, Dreams and Little Big Planet are not exactly implemented and allow the users to create content in the same way that we've seen in these patents, they have allowed users to customize their avatars, create their own unique content, and could perhaps in some ways be seen as a precursor to what's to come. Again, I suspect that a lot of what Sony are doing right now is just kind of researching, trying to figure out exactly what approach they want to take in the longer term. But one thing is for certain, there are billions of dollars at stake here, and companies, not just Sony, don't just want you to have an experience which lasts 10, 20 or 30 hours. They want to keep you invested for the long haul. Ultimately, whether Sony and Microsoft actually launch these consoles is very difficult to know. Projects get cancelled all of the time, unfortunately, as everyone knows. And to kind of repeat myself, I've said this in several videos at this point, like what's happened to the Switch Pro or Switch 4K or whatever. I actually leaked the existence of the thing, and other websites were reporting much the same as well. And I'm 100% that the development kits were being tested internally at Nintendo. In fact, we've even seen pretty much evidence of this with the Nintendo, evidence of basically the Switch Pro, or whatever it was intended to be called, basically being shown in Nvidia hacks and drivers. So obviously Nintendo were working on upgraded hardware with DLSS support, pretty much matching what I'd linked, but to my understanding, at least right now, the development kits were removed from internal Nintendo testers, and goodness knows what happened. Maybe Nintendo have decided to upgrade the hardware further still, or make some other changes, or what. So yeah, projects get changed, altered all of the time. But it's going to be very interesting to me, especially with the PlayStation 5 Pro and the push towards PSVR 2, and ultimately as well higher frame rates, better ray tracing. Obviously, Sony as well as Microsoft have longer term plans. It's going to be really interesting to see what occurs with this, especially since Sony obviously are doubling down at the moment on PC development. As of the time I'm recording this, Spider-Man, or at least the original one, as well as Miles Morales, have essentially been announced for the PC. And I think there's going to be a lot less of a delay between the PlayStation and PC release. That's what I've personally been hearing for quite some time, and I think that it's pretty evident at this point. I don't think we're going to get to the point anytime soon where a new game gets released on the PlayStation 5 and then like a day later it gets launched on the PC, but I suspect there's going to be a lot less of a time delay between the two. And I think it makes sense because ultimately Sony, of course, want to make as much money as possible. And yeah, I think Microsoft and Sony are going to be in pretty stiff competition with one another. It's going to be a while, I think, before we have to worry about, them just doing away with home consoles and switching entirely to streaming. I think that, personally, this is not based upon a leak. I think we're going to get like the PS6 at minimum, and then maybe like the PlayStation 7 or something like that, maybe onwards will be streaming, but who the hell knows, it's so far into the future. But yeah, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. If you did, then of course leave a likey on the video and all of that jazz, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.